Filipinos speak English better than most of the world. That's not opinion. That's data. That's lived reality. We rank among the highest in global English proficiency year after year. Our workforce runs international companies behind the scenes. Our voices answer customer calls in every time zone. Our nurses explain medical procedures to patients thousands of miles from home. Our seafarers navigate global trade routes. Our teachers stand in classrooms far from the islands, shaping young minds in a language that was never originally ours, but became ours anyway. English is woven into our daily lives, into our education, into our survival. And yet, many Filipinos pause before speaking. There's a hesitation, a second of doubt, a quiet calculation. Not because we don't know the words, not because we don't understand the grammar, but because of how those words might sound when they leave our mouths. We are praised for our fluency, then laughed at for our accent, complimented in one breath, corrected in the next. Your English is very good, but corrected, imitated, exaggerated for humor, turned into punchlines on television, turned into memes online, turned into something to fix. The contradiction cuts deep. English opened doors for us, jobs, mobility, opportunity. But it also taught us something else. It taught us shame. For more than a century, English in the Philippines was never just a language. It was a filter, a test, a measuring stick. Sound American, and you're intelligent. Sound British, and you're refined. Sound Filipino, and you're trying. That belief didn't appear overnight. It was planted during colonial classrooms, watered through policy and schooling, passed down from teacher to student, generation after generation. Classrooms emphasized pronunciation drills over critical thinking, tongue placement over original thought, sounding right over saying something meaningful. Students weren't just taught what to say, they were taught how not to sound. Neutralize your accent, smooth your edges, hide the trace of where you came from. The message was subtle, but constant. Speak well, but not like that. Be fluent, but not too Filipino. Express yourself, but don't sound like yourself. And over time, that message settled in. The lesson was clear. Your ideas might be intelligent, your thoughts might be valid, your experiences might be real. But your voice? Your voice is something to apologize for. Here's the irony no one talks about. The world depends on Filipino English. Not occasionally, not casually, systematically. When companies need empathy, they call Filipinos. When customers are angry, scared, or confused, it's Filipino voices that calm them down. When brands want loyalty, warmth, and patience, they rely on Filipino communication. When hospitals need care, they hire Filipinos. Nurses explaining procedures in gentle English. Caregivers reassuring patients through pain and fear. Medical professionals translating complex language into human understanding. When ships cross oceans, Filipinos guide them. Seafarers coordinating logistics, safety, and navigation. All in clear, accented English across radios and ports and borders. Our voices answer emergencies at 3 a.m. Our voices de-escalate conflict. Our voices explain, reassure, apologize, and solve. Our voices keep global systems running when the rest of the world is asleep. And no one questions our English then. No one asks us to repeat ourselves when lives, money, and infrastructure are on the line. But leadership? Leadership requires a different sound, a neutral sound. A polished sound, a sound that feels familiar to power. Filipino English is trusted with responsibility, but not authority. Trusted to execute, not trusted to decide. Trusted to support, not trusted to lead. Good enough to serve, not good enough to speak last. Good enough to explain the policy, not good enough to create it. Good enough to carry the system, not good enough to represent it. That invisible barrier isn't written anywhere, but everyone feels it, in interviews, in boardrooms, in global conferences. It's the pause before approval, the raised eyebrow, the subtle redirect to someone who sounds more convincing. That barrier has a name. It's not lack of education. It's not lack of competence. It's not lack of intelligence. It's accent bias, the belief that authority must sound a certain way to be believed. And millions of Filipinos live under that ceiling every single day, speaking clearly, working globally, contributing endlessly, while being quietly told again and again, your voice is useful, but it is not powerful, until someone stands up and refuses to accept that lie. Leo Reyes didn't grow up rehearsing speeches. He didn't practice in front of mirrors. He didn't memorize lines meant for applause. He grew up watching tides. In a small coastal town in the Visayas, life moved with the sea. Mornings began before sunrise. Evenings ended with salt still in the air. His father woke while the sky was dark, pushing a small boat into open water, never fully certain what the day would bring back. His mother sold what they could at the market: fish, goods, small comforts, measuring success in enough to get by. There were no boardrooms, no podiums, no polished stages. Only waves, weather, and waiting. English came from public school classrooms, from chalkboards worn thin, from teachers doing their best with limited time and resources. It was spoken slowly, warmly, with a regional accent that carried home in every syllable. Leo never worried about sounding foreign. He wasn't trying to impress anyone across an ocean. He cared about understanding the books he borrowed, understanding the news he overheard, understanding why the sea, once generous, was becoming unpredictable. Books became his escape. Stories became his window. Through second-hand novels and dog-eared pages, he traveled beyond his shoreline, to places he had never seen but could suddenly imagine. Climate change wasn't a headline flashing across a screen. It wasn't an abstract debate or a distant warning. It was personal. Each year the shoreline crept closer to their homes. Each storm lasted longer, hit harder, left deeper scars. Each fishing trip carried more risk than the last. Leo watched adults worry in silence. He watched resilience become routine. And slowly English became more than a subject in school. It became his bridge. A bridge from his village to the wider world, from lived experience to global conversations, from a small coastal town to questions that crossed borders. His English wasn't polished. It didn't sound like television anchors. It didn't pretend to be anything else, but it carried truth. And that made it powerful. Leo's scholarship to a top university in Manila was supposed to change everything. It was the reward for years of discipline, late nights, quiet ambition carried from a small town to a bigger world. He arrived believing this was where his voice would finally matter. Instead, it introduced him to a new fear. The moment he spoke in class, the room shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, subtly. Heads tilted, eyes narrowed just slightly. A pause that shouldn't have been there. His accent stood out. Not because it was unclear, but because it was unfamiliar. There were smiles, polite, restrained, distant. Requests to repeat himself, even when he'd been understood. Nods that came too quickly, as if to move on. And then the comments. They sounded encouraging. They were framed as advice. Your English is good, but have you tried softening your pronunciation? You're smart, just work on how you sound. That word, but hung in the air longer than anything else, he said. It followed him out of the classroom, into hallways, into his own thoughts. He began rehearsing sentences before speaking, testing words in his head before letting them escape, measuring breath, tone, pace. He avoided raising his hand, chose silence over scrutiny, shrank his presence to protect himself. Slowly doubt crept in. Maybe they were right. Maybe he didn't belong here. Maybe his voice was a liability. It wasn't his ideas that were judged first. It wasn't his arguments or insights. It was his voice. And that distinction mattered. Many would have gone silent for good. Leo came close. Very close. Then something clicked. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Quietly. Leo began to notice a pattern. The people who spoke the smoothest didn't always say the most. The ones with flawless accents often filled the room with confidence, but not substance. Their words sounded impressive, yet floated above reality. They spoke about issues. Leo had lived inside them. He listened closely. Debates filled with jargon, discussions detached from consequence, opinions polished but distant. And that's when it became clear. Leo had something they didn't. Stories, not rehearsed ones, not borrowed ones, real ones. Stories shaped by tides and storms, by uncertainty and survival, by watching climate change rewrite daily life. He realized he had been fighting the wrong battle. He stopped chasing sound, stopped measuring himself against someone else's voice, and instead he started chasing clarity. What mattered wasn't how he sounded, it was whether people understood him. A mentor saw the shift before Leo did. One day they told him something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Don't erase your accent, shape your message. So Leo leaned in. He joined debate teams, not to dominate, but to sharpen his thinking under pressure. He spoke at rallies where conviction mattered more than polish. He stood before crowds and told stories instead of performing fluency. No exaggerated pronunciation, no borrowed cadence, no apology for where he came from. Something changed. People leaned forward. They stopped interrupting. They remembered what he said. Not because he sounded foreign, not because he sounded impressive, but because he sounded real. And real, it turned out, was powerful. At an international summit, it happened again. Different country, same moment. Leo was mid-sentence when the interruption came. Not loud, not aggressive, casual. It's hard to understand your accent. The words landed heavier than they sounded. The room froze. Conversations stalled. Pens paused mid-air. Eyes shifted, some toward Leo, others away from him. Old shame knocked. The familiar voice from years ago whispered back in. Lower your tone. Fix your sound. Don't make this uncomfortable. Leo felt it rise in his chest. Then he breathed, slowly. He looked up, not defensively, not angrily. And he spoke. My accent isn't the problem. Listening is. No edge, no apology, just clarity. For a moment, no one moved. Then something unexpected happened. A delegate from Kenya leaned forward and nodded. A voice from Brazil followed. Firm, supportive. Then another, from India. Different countries, different histories, different accents, same experience. They spoke about being interrupted, about being misunderstood, about being dismissed before their ideas could land. The room shifted again, but this time in Leo's favor. What had been framed as a personal flaw was suddenly exposed as a shared pattern. This wasn't about pronunciation, it wasn't about grammar, it wasn't even about English, it was about power. Who gets uninterrupted space? Who is asked to repeat themselves? Who is granted authority the moment they speak? Leo realized something profound in that moment. Accent bias isn't random, it follows hierarchy. The closer your voice sounds to power, the less you're questioned. The farther it sounds, the more you're asked to prove yourself. That summit didn't end with applause. There were no standing ovations. But something more important happened. A line was drawn, and Leo stepped over it. He understood now. His voice didn't need permission. It needed presence, and he was done shrinking it. When the United Nations reached out, Leo was stunned, not because it was prestigious, but because it was unexpected. They didn't ask for credentials. They didn't ask for a polished resume filled with titles and affiliations. They asked for his voice, and they were clear about why. They didn't want refinement. They didn't want rehearsal. They wanted truth. That realization brought pride, and with it, fear. Old doubts resurfaced quietly. What if the world laughed? What if his accent became the headline instead of his message? What if everything he had worked to accept about himself was suddenly tested in front of millions? This wasn't a classroom anymore. This wasn't a conference room. This was the world's most powerful stage. Suggestions came quickly. Speech coaches offered to help him smooth things out. Advisors suggested minor adjustments, just a few changes, they said. Nothing drastic. Leo listened. Then he declined. He refused coaching, refused modification, refused to soften the very thing that carried his story. Because he knew if he erased his accent here, he erased the reason he was invited. So he went home, back to the place where his voice had never been questioned. He wrote his speech walking along the shore of his hometown. Feet sinking into sand he had known since childhood. Salt in the air. Wind steady, familiar. He listened to fishermen talk about storms, about seasons changing too fast, about uncertainty that never made headlines. He listened to waves crash, retreat, and return. Unapologetic, consistent, persistent. Each line of his speech took shape there, not in an office, not under fluorescent lights, but where his voice had always belonged. When doubt crept in again, he called his father. He explained the pressure, the fear, the weight of representing more than himself. His father didn't offer advice about pronunciation. He didn't talk about strategy. He said only this: "Speak the way you speak to us." And in that moment, Leo understood. That was the only instruction he needed. Leo stood at the podium. The green marble beneath his hands was cool and unfamiliar. The lights were brighter than he expected. The room larger, heavier, filled with history. Cameras were everywhere, red lights blinking. Every movement captured, every pause recorded. The silence was thick, not empty, loaded. Delegates sat still, headsets ready, pens poised. This was the moment his fear had been rehearsing for years. Leo took a breath. Then he began. "Magandang araw sa inyong lahat. Good day to you all." The Filipino greeting landed first. Gentle, warm, unmistakably his. A bridge, quietly placed between worlds. A pause. "I am Leo Reyes, a fisherman's son from the Philippines, and I bring a message from the sea." His voice was steady. Not rushed, not apologetic. He didn't speak like a diplomat. He spoke like someone who knew what he was talking about. He spoke of coral reefs bleaching beneath rising temperatures, of storms that no longer followed seasons, of villages that rebuilt again and again because leaving was never an option. He spoke of fear, not dramatic fear, but the quiet kind that lives in everyday decisions. The fear of sending your father out to sea when the weather can no longer be trusted. His English was clear, his accent unmistakable, and the room listened. Then he stopped, looked up, and said the words no one expected to hear in that room. "Do not confuse accent with ignorance. This is the sound of the front lines." The sentence didn't rush past them. It stayed. The hall went completely still. No shifting in seats, no whispered translations, just silence. The kind of silence that means something has landed. Then a hand came together. Then another. Applause. Not polite, not obligatory. Real. Measured at first, then growing. Delegates from the global south stood. Then others followed. The sound filled the hall, rising, rolling forward like a tide. A standing ovation. For a voice that had once been told to soften itself. For an accent that had been asked to disappear. For a truth that could no longer be ignored. In that moment, it wasn't just Leo Reyes being applauded. It was every voice that had ever been interrupted, every speaker who had been underestimated, every accent that had been mistaken for weakness. The fisherman's son didn't just speak to the world, he taught it how to listen. That day something shifted, not because English changed, but because listening did. Filipino English wasn't corrected. It was respected. And millions watching realized something powerful. Their voice was never the problem. The world doesn't need one perfect accent. It needs truth, spoken bravely in every sound from every shore. Filipino English didn't shock the world because it was different. It shocked the world because it was real.